So happy to get started. So I'm so excited about the opportunity for all of you to hear from our two panelists today because they're just incredible. Both of them in their own right, huge careers, huge, just absolute powerhouses in the areas of HR, but also just in business. So today we're talking about how CHROs can embrace their inner CHFO, and it's a topic we've been talking about a lot. And actually, it spawned from Orlando. So Orlando, in full disclosure, is a member of my board of directors here at Syndio. So I'm Maria. I'm the CEO of Syndio, and Orlando was in HR for a really long time, and then made the move to lead a company. So led Holland America, and we'll get to that a little bit in a moment when I introduce him officially. But we started having these conversations about what does it take for a CHRO to start honing their business acumen in a way that would enable them to not only have a seat at the table, because through the pandemic, I think CHROs are actually seeing this peopleification of the boardroom where they've got a spot, but how do they then use metrics, use data to show up like a functional leader? And so this whole idea of how do you move from being a CHRO to having some of those qualities and metrics that you would commonly see with functional leaders and CFOs? The role is evolving rapidly. And I think a lot of that is because of some of the hurdles that have now become opportunities to give a true leadership position to folks who are leading the people organizations. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. So let's go ahead and move forward. So a little bit on housekeeping, we love to take your questions. So if you haven't been to a Syndio webinar before, we are really interactive with our audience. So I would highly encourage you use Q&A or chat. One of those can keep you anonymous if you want to be anonymous. The other one shows sort of who you are. So pick which one you want, and I will be monitoring that throughout the session and just throwing out your questions as we go. So we're going to spend most of our time today in a conversation. So we'll do like a little bit of an intro with slides, and then we're going to take the slides down, and it's just going to be the three of us talking, and we want you to be part of that conversation. So pull up the proverbial chair and throw a question into the chat. We're not going to wait until the end for those questions. We will be taking them all along the way. So I would just highly encourage you to ask questions. So who are we? Who am I? Why am I doing this? My name is Maria Colacurcio. I'm the CEO of Syndio. We are a software platform, and we cater to organizations, typically Fortune 2000, and we offer them software solutions to analyze and resolve pay and opportunity gaps that are because of something like gender, race, or ethnicity. So you can see sort of a sampling of our customers on this slide below. And if you have more questions about how to work with us or who works with us, you're always free to just shoot me a message afterwards. You will all get this deck. Okay, so let's get into the good stuff. I want to introduce our two speakers today. So first, Christina Hall. She is the CHRO at Instacart, who recently, if you watch the news at all, you know that they went public this week. So she oversees Instacart's human resources, recruiting, workplace culture, employee experience, DEI, I mean, all of the things as CHRO. But beyond that, she brings more than 2 decades of experience advancing talent at high-performing tech companies. So before Instacart, she was the chief people officer at LinkedIn. And before that, she held key roles at Meta, formerly Facebook, and Intuit. So before that, Christina is a reformed, or not reformed, I don't know, Christina, how you'd put it, but she worked for law firms. So she is a lawyer. Recovering reformed. And in that capacity, she focused on exec comp and employee benefits, but it really brings her this perspective that is able to intersect a lot of the issues that we talk about, in particular around pay equity and workplace equity, because she also has that background in employment law. So thank you, Christina, for being here and for being such a long-time supporter and advocate.
Great to be here.
And second, we have Orlando Ashford. So he is currently the Chief People Officer at Fanatics. He's also a board director, and we are so lucky and privileged to have him on our board at Syndio. He's also an investor and an author. So if you haven't read his book, please go check it out. It's fantastic. It's a quick read with tons of actionable insights on how to get the job you want. He also serves as a board director for Perigo. Am I saying that right? Is it
Yeah, Perigo, that's it.
Perigo? Okay. As well as many other organizations. And in many cases, on the board of directors, he is the chair of the compensation committee. So the other thing that's really interesting about Orlando, other than all of this board work that he's doing, which is massive and gives him the ability to have a huge impact with companies, he volunteers. So he's on the board of Streetwise Partners. He joined the Orange Bowl Committee of South Florida, which I think is interesting because it just shows that breadth and depth of where he wants to put his time and work. And before he took the new role at Fanatics as Chief People Officer, he was the president of Holland America, leading the cruise line's brand and business, including the fleet of 14 premium vessels, which carried, I didn't know this either, Orlando, before reading your bio, more than 900,000 guests annually to all 7 continents. And before that, as I talked about at the beginning, he had a very long career primarily in HR in addition to all this board work, and then made that leap to lead a company as president, and now is back in the seat as CHRO. So I think he's going to be just a fantastic addition to the conversation today. Thanks for being here.
Happy to. Thanks for the opportunity.
Of course. Okay, so we're going to do the 5 minutes where I talk at you, and then we're going to move to a conversation with our 2 guests. So I just want to set the stage quickly in terms of how is the role of CHRO changing? So I think what's really interesting here is, I mentioned it earlier, but that peopleification of the boardroom. You're starting to see the background as a chief people officer or a CHRO become very, very valuable and desirable when folks are looking to add independent board directors. And you can see that on the top left here. 80% of corporate board directors believe that HR as a function will become even more strategic in the next 1 to 3 years. And the next one, 54% of corporate board directors believe HR will be critical in helping companies navigate challenges. So we're starting to see this up-leveling not only within companies and the 4 walls of the company, but also from the perspective of the variety of boards that have supervision over the fiduciary metrics and things like that of the companies. They're starting to see this as a really, really important role. And that's a big evolution, because I know from my own experience in the boardroom before, the people update was something that often got just slammed into the appendix and there was never time for it. Maybe you did it in the last 5 minutes, or maybe the CHRO wasn't even in the room. They were sort of a cameo once a year. And I think what you're seeing is that's really changing. Board members want to hear from the CHRO. They're interested in this skill set, and they really believe that this skill set is critical. Now, the last thing I'll mention, and this is very probably acutely obvious to all of you, but only 25% of respondents in this strongly agreed that they had the budget and headcount needed to support what they wanted to do, particularly around pay equity and workplace equity. So we really see, when we talk about how can we support CHROs as they think about bringing metrics to bear, particularly in the boardroom and as they're presenting upward, we think about 5 things as it relates to workplace equity. So first, let me define workplace equity. When we think about workplace equity, it's pay equity, equal pay for equal work, and opportunity equity. And I would say the metric that most reflects opportunity equity, internal mobility, representation, is that unadjusted pay gap. So what is the average? So if you have all your men up here and all your women down here, you're going to have a large gender pay gap. That's different from equal pay for equal work, which is pay equity. So we really see workplace equity as the combination of both. So when we're talking to CHROs and they're like, this is great, but I really need to figure out what is my dashboard of metrics that I bring to the board to show up in a way that's similar to my counterparts who all have their hands on data, we recommend 5 things. And this is part of what we do with our software. The first is representation. So what does your company look like? What does it look like at a functional level? What is the gender, race, ethnicity breakdown? What is it that you look like? Because in order to figure out what types of aspirational goals, and let's be really clear, I said goals, not quotas. So we're not talking about quotas. We're talking about a system that is progressive and lawful. But what type, in order to do that, you have to know what you look like now. So what do you look like? What do you look like functionally? What do you look like across the organization? The next metric we really recommend is promotion. So this is about how are people moving through your organization. When you think about internal mobility, you think about all of the funds you need for learning and development, for talent development, to roll out skills and resource training in order to fill the gaps where you need more talent. You've got to understand what's the average time to promotion? What does promotion look like across the different functions in your organization? So that would be metric 2 that we would recommend having in your sort of suite or dashboard that you're presenting. The third is, when do people leave? Why do people leave? What is there a retention gap between various compensate or combinations of folks? Are there differences based on the background? Do you have issues as it relates to attrition by gender? How are you slicing and dicing the data? But at the heart of it, it's, when do people leave? Why do people leave? Do we have a sense and our arms around the data that relates to attrition? So that would be number 3. The third, and this is showing pay gap, but I would sort of lump both into the 4th bucket, which is pay equity and pay gap. So what we're looking at is a dashboard representation of pay gap. So again, it's that average. But what we recommend as the 4th metric is a combination of pay equity. So think of that as, cents on the dollar or pay parity. How are you looking at equal pay for equal work? What's your stat on that? And then your unadjusted gap. So those are 2 things that would be combined in the 4th one. The last thing we recommend, and this is the one that I think there's a lot of room to grow for CHROs moving into that mindset of a CHFO, is benchmarking. So a lot of times when we talk about benchmarking, this is something that's just common knowledge for the other functions around the table. And that is, as compared to what? So how are women represented compared to all others in engineering? So this is looking at as compared to what within your 4 walls. And then if we go to the next one, there's a really important element of benchmarking that is looking at time and money. So how much time is it going to take to hit the goal that you've set, and how much is it going to cost us? And so all of these things are able to give you that broader context and set the stage with comparing yourself to yourself in terms of a benchmark, but also to companies that look like you, as well as setting a benchmark in terms of time and money. How long is it going to take to get there, and how much is it going to cost? So that's just a quick snapshot of sort of the 5 metrics. And we get asked this all the time when we talk about, how can a CHRO show up and really encompass the metrics that they need to have in the boardroom, other than just sort of the people metrics. How do you get specific and think about it in 5 ways that will be really clear and help you plead your case as you're talking about the organization? So that's my part. Now we're going to move into the good stuff. So I want to start out with a question really for both of you to sort of set the stage, and either one of you can answer. But you saw the stats that I presented at the beginning, and I'm curious, do you feel like the to-do list for CHROs has expanded in the past 5 years? And if so, like, what was it and what is it now?
You want me to start, Orlando?
Sure.
Christina, I'm going to let you go first.
Sure.
Yeah.
I would say that I really get the feeling that the to-do list is sort of moved up in the agenda. To your point, Maria, it used to be that like all the HR questions or people data was something that was always last on the agenda. And if the time allowed, then you got your moment. And I think that has really changed, where the board and board members want to hear about that as part of all of the other data that they want to hear about at the company. And it's like sort of an emphasis has changed that does, it puts more pressure on the HR function to do a better job with pulling data together, because they have to be ready to answer more questions because there's more time for it.
Yeah, I've got two indicators of the shift. I'll start with my boards. So I've been serving on boards for over 12 years now, and early days, the board, the compensation committee was called just that, compensation committee. Maybe a relic back, the personnel committee. But over the course of these last 10, 11, 12 years, every single board that I'm on that comp committee has morphed into what we're now calling a human capital committee or talent committee or something along those lines, and the agenda for those committees has expanded. And so it's more than just annually kind of coming and rubber stamping bonuses or pay or things like that. We're having real insightful conversations about talent and a lot of the things that you outlined in the beginning, of Maria. What's happening with the representation? What's the story around our employees? And do we have more than our fair share of the ready-made talent that we need to deliver and execute on the agenda that the company has? So that's one. And then I'll personalize it with the job that I have now. My boss, Michael Rubin, has been a wildly successful entrepreneur. He's a billionaire a couple times over. Has never had a head of HR until 10 months ago. He's got good HR instincts and he kind of just did it, but he's never had a head of HR. And so the way we structured my role, we did this on purpose. I duly report to Michael, our CEO, and I also sort of have a direct connection to our CFO, who's never had strategic HR. When we started working together, and he was outlining kind of his thoughts around HR, I made the comment, I said, it's clear as you're talking to me, and as I'm new to this company, you're used to building or hiring or working with tactical HR. I said, I have to let you know you've hired a strategic HR person. To which he said, well, what's the difference? I said, you know what? I could explain it to you, but let's wait a few months and you'll tell me. And he literally walked into my office after one of our sessions and he said, I get it now. Because I was showing up the way he showed up, as a CFO. Here's these metrics and here's the story that we're telling about the dynamics of the company via the financials. Well, I'm going to tell a story about what's happening with the employees that actually enable the financials. And I've got my metrics that are indicating where we're strong and where we're weak. And so we're actually able to show up as pretty strong partners as we engage with the executive team around what's happening financially, fiscally, and interpersonally with our assets. And so that's the shift. That's how I see it.
I love that. And that's such a great story because I think there are a lot of CEOs that think in that exact same way. And it's not until they can experience a real strategic people leader that they understand the difference between the strategy and the tactics and why both are so crucial. So I want to expand on that and get a little bit more specific because the audience that attends our webinars tends to like real actionable things they can take away. So I gave sort of a sense from a workplace equity perspective, because that's obviously our bread and butter, the 5 things that we think are really important to translate into metrics. But I would love to ask both of you, what's the crucial data for measuring the health of your people? Like what hard metrics are you standardizing on to present to leadership, maybe not your board, but to your leadership team and or your board, however you want to answer it, about the state of your organization?
You want to kick it off, Orlando?
I mean, I can, sure, I'll start. I mean, look, the 5 areas that you outlined, Marie, are a great anchor. And then there are what I'll call double clicks into each of those areas, depending on what you're managing or working through. So, my ambition is to be Christina in about 18 to 24 months as we're trying to go public as a company. And so the types of things that we're focused on are in line with that. So a lot of energy around what's happening with our employee base from an engagement perspective, what's happening with our employee base around compensation. We were having a kind of a conversation before we came on, because you've got people, base and bonus, but equity was something that was sitting there, wasn't really valued. Now that we're starting to talk about an IPO, all of a sudden there's a lot of energy around equity. And so we're having conversations about how we handle compensation. How are we paying? How well are people paid within the ranges? How many people are we overpaying? Are we getting performance for that overpay? Things that we did as a startup that people weren't thinking about, right? When you start up a company, you tend to be a little more aggressive with pay because you're coming on board to something that's fuzzy. Well, we've matured. Fanatics is now 10, 11, 12 years old, but we still have startup mentality in the company. So now we're putting in parameters to really hold managers accountable to how we pay within the range. And if people are what I'll call more aggressively paid, then in connecting that to performance, I'm happy to be aggressive in pay as long as we're getting performance for that pay. those are questions that were not answered, or conversations that were not had 10, 11, 12 months ago. We're having them now. And so it's having the data and then putting things together to tell a story relative to where the company is in its current journey. 2 years from now, we should be able to come off of that conversation, hopefully, because we will have fixed it. And then there'll be something else that we might need to talk to because we'll be at a different place in the journey. Hopefully that's helpful.
I love that. And Christina, I want to reframe my original question based on what he said, because I think it's more interesting. How would you take those 5 data points that I went through, the representation, promotion, attrition, pay gap, benchmarking, and tell a story? Like, how do you use those to explain and give a narrative around what's happening in the organization? And are any of those more important than the other when you're telling the story?
I think that the way that you tell the story is really important, and sort of getting back to the very premise of this webinar, it's both the data and the narrative. And I think maybe historically, if people think about HR in the non-strategic context, it's either, very fluffy, just ideas, or it's functionary the CFO telling you budgets and acting. And the difference, I think what we're talking about today is you start with some principles of what you want to be behind the data that you're presenting or what you're going for. And then you start to take those key areas, and the 5 you've presented, Maria, are great. And the more you can start to say, okay, these are the data points that we're going to be looking at, and here's what we're striving for from a principled point of view. And you can do that repetitively in a way that allows you to grow a narrative with your board is really important. Because that's really what a CFO does. They're not coming up with new numbers every quarter. They're hearkening back to, here's what our goals are. HR is really the same way. And I think the more that you're able to sort of connect, again, principles and a narrative to the data, the more that it really lands with a board member who's deeply analytical and maybe thinks of themselves as, that very popular phrase, data driven.
Yeah, can I add on that? I'll give it a real tangible example. So we had a situation. Again, we look at how well are we doing in terms of pay within the range. Are we paying 50th percentile, 80th percentile, 20th percentile, or whatever? And you get that report, and it shows who's paying on par, or paying to market, and who might be too aggressive or not. And you could take that and then just report it. You're doing good, you're doing bad. But we had a situation where there was a pocket of engineers that were very aggressively paid. And so we asked the question, look, according to what we're seeing here, you're paying above market, significantly above market. We look at the turnover number. Nobody's leaving. It's creating some internal equity challenge. People from the other groups want to transfer to this group because you're overpaid. So at first blush, conflict. The business is like, oh, here comes HR, here comes corporate, going to help us out, going to ruin what we're doing here. But once we really double clicked into it, we got clear that we were paying for very specific skills around a very specific element that was going to be critical to one of our businesses. So the message to the board is, hey, this business is making a decision to invest in this capability, and therefore are willing to be aggressive with the pay in order to support the product. Now, the product needs to win, and it needs to deliver, and they have to be accountable for all that, but I can then now back you up. So it goes from me being a police officer, hey, you're overpaying, to I understand strategically why you're being aggressive with pay around those jobs, and let's differentiate those jobs from these other jobs so that we don't create an inequity issue across the whole company, and then we can do it from a strategic business perspective. That's the difference. So it's not just having metrics to be the police. It's having metrics to know where to dig, ask those questions, and then understand, oh, that does support the business. I can support you, or not. If there was no rationale around why we were paying so aggressively, then I would have kept pushing. No, you need to change that. You see what I'm saying? So I think that's an important distinction.
I love that. And I think those personal anecdotes are so helpful, in particular for the audience, because so many of us have dealt with exactly the same scenarios, just with a different flavor. So I think that's really useful. I'm curious to kind of talk about the thing that everybody's talking about right now. And we at Syndio have been hosting a series of board dinners to talk about workplace equity in the boardroom and how to advance it. And so my question is more around with the blowback that's happening around ESG, around, the Supreme Court decision with Harvard. We have a very particular point of view on that because we provide solutions that are gender-based agnostic that help with measurement and accountability. And they're really the most progressive and lawful solutions out there so that companies can still work toward their goals functionally and identify whether they have those broken rungs. But I know this is a more difficult conversation now, even though the benefits of building obviously a team with folks from diverse backgrounds has kind of been shown over and over again. How are you both managing that? And how are you thinking about using this narrative to tell a story to sort of overcome what might be a lot of surface area right now?
I think for me, again, if you start with sort of the principled approach of what you're trying to do as a company to make your company a place where everyone can succeed, and sort of move away from you said, like, these aren't quotas, these are goals, and sort of talking again about what you're trying to do from a holistic perspective. It for me, it hasn't really changed our approach very much. I think that the Harvard case is something that was, I think people get overly fixated in, like, oh, this is going to be bring big change to an environment that for us really wasn't that huge of a deal.
Yeah, I agree with Christina. My organization and the boards that I'm on, and that's been part of my personal selection process around boards. Yeah, ESG is not a fad, but we haven't gotten into the fad elements of ESG. And what do I mean by that? Where those issues are core to how we think about running our business and running it successfully, whether you called it ESG or not, hasn't changed. We were doing it before ESG came about, and we'll be doing it as long as it's called ESG or when it's called something else, because it's fundamental to how we're running our business, governing our business. And so, and quite frankly, that's part of my selection process when I decide to join a board or decide to come out of retirement to go to work for Fanatics or someplace else. Is this something that you believe in? Because I believe that it makes for a better company. Again, talking about those metrics, looking at representation and things like that, that's great. But then how do we quickly translate that into a connection to making for a better business? And so if companies believe that it makes for a better business, you'll want to see that as a proof point that you're moving in the right direction as a company. So that's how I think about it.
One sort of simple thing is we just stop talking about it as ESG. We talk about impact, and really looking at what we're trying to do overall, as opposed to checking some sort of ESG box.
I agree with that completely.
That's helpful. So tying it to the performance of the business, just like any other functional leader would do. I think that's really smart. So Orlando, I want to start with you on this one. And then Christina, I want to move to you because you both have such broad experience beyond the people organization. Christina, you came out of employment law, and Orlando, I think you have a unique perspective because you were a people leader, then you became president at Holland America, and then now you're back in the world of HR as Fanatics CHRO. So can you just share with us a little bit? And you and I have had the chance to talk about this one-on-one, and I love your stories, whether it's from, doubling down during a pandemic or, other elements of your leadership. Like, help us understand now how you bring that perspective. First of all, how you brought that people perspective to your role as president, and then how you're bringing that president role back in as a people leader. Because I hear you talk a lot about, this has a quantitative, calculable business benefit. Share with us how those experiences sort of flowed into one another and what you learned.
Yeah, I mean, look, when I was first approached about this opportunity with Holland America, I was resistant. I'd grown up in HR. I was a strategic HR person, a business-oriented HR person, which is what had made me successful. But I was resistant to the idea of making a leap into actually running a business. It was like a 9-month process. But once I did it, I understood why, because what I had inherited, while the cruise industry is big ships and a lot of technology. So if I was touching any buttons on board, that would have been a problem. But it was really a people business. It was really about talent, people, and culture. And how do you build a culture with the crew and the staff? How do you build a culture with the folks on land? How do you build a culture with the guests? And what were the metrics that we were putting in place? Net promoter scores, not just for customers, but net promoter scores for employees. What you found was a happy employee treated the guests better. The guests spent more money. That's literally how we went about it. And so we really focused on the engagement and taking care of the employees, the crew members. Imagine, when you on board a ship, you're leaving your family 6 to 9 months at a time, floating around the world in complete service to random strangers each and every week. And we needed 17,000 people that loved to do that. That was an HR job. And so figuring out how to create that energy translated to a great experience for the guests, which then translated to the financial results that we were able to achieve. Now, coming back full circle, when I was asked to come to Fanatics, and part of their thought was, again, my boss had never had an HR leader. He says, if I am going to do this, I want an HR leader that understands how to run a scaled business. And so the way I show up when I'm advising the CEOs of our sub businesses is a little bit different, because I was them. I was that president. I was that person running that business. And so again, when repeating the example I just gave before, so when we do the analysis and we find, okay, this pocket of engineers is very aggressively paid, rather than just shining a light and starting to complain and saying you're out of whack, you need to change your comp structure, we could do the double click and understand, well, why are we paying these engineers aggressively? And we found out why in partnership with the business. And so then I could then represent that very differently to the board in a way that was supportive of the business, because I was that person. And so that's where this whole concept of being that CHFO, the HR's job is to do more than just report. There are times when that's part of it, but it's also try to understand the why and how does that why relate to driving and enabling the business. And so I've been fortunate to have been.
Awesome. Christina, thoughts from your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, well, first of all, I think Orlando's story is such an interesting one. Like it's amazing to hear him tell about sort of the role of a president. And I'd never thought about a cruise ship in that way. Yet I completely believe that, happier employees make for better customer experiences. So that was great to hear about. I think for me, part of what I'm always trying to do is ensure that our CEO and our CFO understand that I'm a steward of the company's money as much as anybody else, because our biggest expenses are our people. And so it's sort of making that connection between sort of taking care of all of our employees and paying them is also sort of helping hold the purse strings and being sure that we're doing the right thing with that huge expenditure. And sort of I'm not absent from that responsibility because I have an HR title. I'm part of that decision process.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And I think it's so helpful because so many folks in your position have this wealth of knowledge beyond the people leader side. And so bringing that to bear is really important. I want to pivot just a minute for an audience question, because I think this is interesting having both of you on here. The question is, I'm a VP level and have my director on the call as well. I'd be really curious what advice you would give to people on your teams and what you're looking for from your teams to help drive the conversation you need to have with leadership and the board? So
For
thinking about
me,
folks that report to you.
yeah. Well, I can start. I mean, one of the things that I am just always trying to make sure members of my team are doing is connecting what they're doing with the other cross-functional organization. So it's, if you're an HRBP, you're not just counseling your leaders and helping employees through tough moments. You should be connecting the issues or the reorganizations that you're doing or any other planning you're doing with the legal team, with the finance team, even with a partnerships team, if we think about how the company is going to grow and evolve. And so the more that HR is weaving itself into the entire fabric of the company, the more great decisions get made overall.
Yeah, I agree with that completely. The thing I'll add to that is the need to make sure that we're. I tease my team, and that we're. So here's what
We lost your audio,
was different.
Orlando. You want to try that one more time? I think we lost your audio.
Can you hear me now? Can you hear me? Oh, you can hear me. Oh, was insights. So I tease. Our job is to not be tattletales. Our job is to tell a story, have a hypothesis, and then try to back that up with the data. And insights can come from any level in the organization, and sometimes the insights are better one or two levels down or into the organization because they're closer to the actual action.
That's great. So just continuing to bring those forward and share the insights that might seem tactical, but that's how you're able to get a broader purview and then roll that up in a way that makes sense.
Yeah, paint a bigger picture. Yeah, exactly.
Okay. So it's no secret, I think, particularly in tech. So Christina, the industry where you've really played a role for a long time. And so as I ask this question, feel free to pull from all of your experiences, not just your current one. And same thing for you, Orlando, but budgets are tight right now for a lot of folks. So I'm curious what advice you have for influencing decisions, especially when it comes to safeguarding resources for the people teams as budgets tighten. So how have you done this successfully, either when you were in those roles trying to convince your boss, or now that you're the head of the function, helping folks figure out how to position things in order to safeguard them? Any thoughts on that?
Well, I think number one, to the extent you can get any good benchmarking to just sort of help ground, how much your company is spending on G&A as a percentage of the full company. And that data you can really get pretty readily a lot from public filings. But then to the extent you can sort of drop down and help explain how much you're spending on HR, recruiting, those pieces, just so you have an understanding, and then you can benchmark over time, even if you can't it's hard to get really detailed data, but if you can show that you're not growing the expenses of your team over time, that's probably a good way to go to in a time of shrinking budgets. The other piece is just, again, showing the sort of the value of what you're doing, because I think a lot of times a really strong compensation and benefits team can be helping the company use their money so much more wisely. Whether that's thinking about how you shift benefits spend to make it less expensive for a company over time, or how you get creative with your compensation so that you're delivering, oomph for employees in the right ways where it really matters, as opposed to overspending. And that gets into back to where we started, you know, what Orlando was talking about, come up with philosophies and principles, you know, have data you're using, and then back it up with anecdotal information. That sort of 3 steps is pretty critical all the time to sort of help underpin why the company is spending, it should be spending the money they're spending on people.
Yeah, I agree with both of those concepts. If you can, and when with the benchmarking idea, the other trick I use, and if you can do this sort of stealthily, it actually has bigger impact. So when I talk to my leaders in conversations, find out which companies they admire. And then when you show up with the benchmark those companies they admire. And if you can get it from them without asking them directly, it's so powerful because then you just, wow, he likes the same companies I like, and they love it. It works perfectly. And hey, we're behind fill in the blank. We're behind Instacart. We're behind Apple. We're behind blah, 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 blah. And then use that energy to get them to react to elevate what you're doing from an investment perspective. And then the other thing I agree with completely, if this idea, if you can tie it back. So yes, I need the extra headcount in comp and ben, because if I can do this analysis better, I'm going to save 5x, 10x, 20x that one person's salary. So let's not be penny wise and pound foolish. Give me the headcount because I'm going to save you so much money on this. Again, strategic HR versus tactical HR.
So that kind of puts us into one of these audience questions I want to throw out. So this question is, I'm curious what advice you'd give for an HR team that's in a building phase, where the foundational areas of HR are being built, but we still want to deliver an insightful strategic perspective for a growing business that's data-centric and fact-based.
Yeah, my take, I mean, I'm actually in the midst of that, right? So I told you a story about coming to work for Fanatics. I'm the first ever sort of enterprise CPO. So I actually have a version of that. So some of what I'm talking about is some of my vision, and we're a big chunk of the way through that, but they don't even know some of the stuff that they're going to be getting next year because we're putting the foundation in place. So I think it's a little bit of both, right? You're kind of flying the plane while you're building it. And so what are those things that are mission critical based on where the company is right now? And then you can start to demonstrate that strategic value around that area. And so for us, there's a lot of energy around compensation. We've hired a whole bunch of people in a short amount of time, and we want to make sure that we're paying them appropriately and then we're getting value for what we are paying. So that's the analysis that we're doing. So we've really focused on those areas and have been able to demonstrate value to the board, to the executive team, and the organization overall in that space. As we put in our new systems and I get even more data, we'll be able to expand the areas that we impact, but I've gotten them used to data and insights with the areas that we have focused on. So the idea of me giving you data and having insights related to the business won't be a new concept. I'll just do it in more areas as my data gets richer. That's how I think about it.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of growing a team, if you're starting off, I mean, the other thing I'd just add is I always feel like it's so important to hire people that want to help you grow. And so if you can find someone who is a deep expert in one space, whether it's compensation, like Orlando mentioned, or a great HRBP or a great people analytics person, if that person is also then invested in growing the full organization with you and sort of has that, I would say, attitude and broadness of scope, then you start with, the right people so that as you add more, sort of everyone can be integrated in well. If you hire people who are like really siloed in their space as you're first growing, I think that's tough, because then it feels like, oh, you've got to have another person right off to begin to balance the thing.
Great advice. So switching gears a little bit, I have 2 more questions for you all. So audience, if you have questions, feel free to chime in. So this one kind of hits right down the fairway of what we do at Syndio, and we're having so many customers come to us asking for help on strategic communication planning around the acceleration of pay transparency laws. So these kicked off, a couple of years ago in New York, requiring salary ranges for any new job posting, which I think led to some of the pay explainability requirements, Orlando, that you're speaking to. You got to be really crisp and clear as to why you pay what you pay, and whether it's the example you gave around particular skills or scarcity of engineers, that's a reason. And you have to be really communicative about that with folks, because now they've got this in their pocket. It's accelerating now even beyond that. You've got Illinois coming out with a law that just went through, which also requires now some transparency and disclosure around career progression. The EU directive, which impacts any global company with a presence in the EU, also has more stipulations for disclosure around promotions and things like that. I'm just curious, how are you all thinking about this, and what's your approach to collaborating with different functions, whether it's legal or your executive team or folks that work for you? Would love to just get some thoughts on how you're thinking about it.
I mean, I can jump in. I mean, the examples that I've been giving around those engineers came out of that work. So it's actually an opportunity. It's a challenge, and there's difficulty, and then there's risks and things like that. But it actually creates some leverage for HR to show up and be that business partner. I'll tell another story. I mean, there was a function, I won't say which one, but there was a function that was going to post a job, and so HR had done its work and said, here's the pay range that we think will fit. That particular function leader decided, I don't think this is the right pay range, expanded the range and posted it and created a whole bunch of havoc. Right. And so, yeah, exactly. You see what I'm dealing with, And so, so I came in, took it down, and then used it as a teachable moment to explain. I know you, in your mind, you say, well, gee, I want a wider range. I can get better talent and attract more people and blah, blah, blah. But in your zeal to do that, did not understand the other implications that you were creating across the company and outside the company by posting that. And so use it as a teachable moment, and then also as a way to, again, show strength as a function for how we can partner with whatever function it is to achieve the end goal, which is hire best-in-class talent relative to the job and the skills that are needed to achieve that job. So as these laws change and get more complex and difficult or challenging, or just challenging in a different way, I encourage my team to use it as an opportunity. It's an opportunity for us to demonstrate our value as a function, to help them navigate these rules and laws to get to the end goal, which is still the same: get best-in-class talent for all the positions. You just have to go about it maybe a little different, because you've got different ways you have to go about it.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think all that's right. I mean, the other thing for my team that's really been useful is, as we're prepping to have all these discussions, we're training our actual execs at the same time, so that it's not just HR that's able to answer these questions. We want to make sure we're explaining to our most senior leaders how we're going to do this, what information we're providing, when we're providing it, where we're providing it, then to the VPs, then to the director of population, and then able to talk about it broadly with employees. Because the more that you're sort of comfortable talking about it, the more that comes through as being transparent. And one of our values as a company is put it all on the table. And so we've got to be sort of really comfortable being clear about what we're doing, what our boundaries are, and talking about that. We have employee all hands every week where people can ask any questions they'd like. And we never want it to feel like a situation where someone asks the question that is a surprise to us, because we know that transparency is something we've got to get in front of. So I would say that the education from sort of top to bottom of the company ends up being part of what we're doing here all the time. Not like HR understands this deeply and then we start educating leaders. It's a sort of one-to-one situation.
Thank you. Okay, last question. We always try to give folks a little bit of buffer on time with these events. So this is my future seeing question, which I think is sort of a staple of our webinars. But if you could look into the future and model out what the metrics would look like in a few years, what would you ideally want to know about them and how they interact? So think about the things you've touched on, which is, what I've heard from both of you is having a proactive look into the data that supports your business goals is really critical. So if you're looking out 3-5 years from now, what are these metrics and data points, dashboards, things like that? What do they look like? What could we at Syndio build for you that would make all your dreams come true?
All right, Christina, you want to start?
Yeah, that is like the if you could rub the like magic lamp kind of thing, what would you come up with? I think I'd love to be able to, in a few years' time, show how closing the pay gap could then also lead to better representation numbers and sort of get to a place where you're able to draw the connections between the work that we're doing in HR to then have representation mimic the available talent pool and have that be a through line of success. So, I mean, that would be ideal if we get there.
Yeah, I'll piggyback on that. I mean, look, at the end of the day, the goal for our function is to identify and attract and retain more than our fair share of ready-made talent for the positions that you have within your company. And so the goal behind having all of this data is to give insights and indications as to how well you're doing at that. Are people upset? Are people thinking about leaving? Are people disgruntled? Are people not engaged? Or how can they be engaged better? And blah, 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 blah. And so as we collect this data around comp and engagement and turnover and representation and equity and stuff, it's all intended to be predictive of how engaged and ready your talent is to deliver and execute what they need to deliver. So the smarter we can get around those benchmarks and those analytics to be predictive of that, that's the end goal. I want to be able to look at a person and have them take a test or interview them or assess them so that we can know that person is going to love working here and they're going to be amazing and they're going to make us billions of dollars. That's the goal. And so the organization and the function that can figure out how to do that most efficiently wins. That's what all this is about. It really is. And so things that we can do to accelerate our learning, to figure out the analytics that allow us to predict that, that's what we're all looking for.
Awesome answers. I love those answers. We're going to wrap up. Thank you so much. I was watching the chat comments roll in and people just are loving the conversation and just the level at which you're both speaking to it from personal anecdotes and all of your expertise. So just so that the audience knows, we will send out the deck and the recording. Feel free to share it on LinkedIn, tag these two. And thank you for all your questions. And both of you, thank you for the time and for sharing your insights with us today. We appreciate it.
Happy to. Thanks for thinking of me.
Yes, thanks so much for including us. It was great. Have a nice day.
All right, take care.
See ya.
Bye.